So there are a lot of ups and downs in the Elm Street franchise, and when you go from movies 7, 8, and 9 that are spaced out 16 years apart, you end up with 3 very different movies with some of the biggest ups and downs. So let's talk about it. What is up, everybody? Welcome to Mad Blood, and today I'm going to be talking about kind of the rise and fall of the 7th, 8th, and 9th movies in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, which is a 16-year time span, which definitely has some fun moments, but also has some of the lowest of lows in the franchise, including probably the most hated movie in the entire franchise. All right, and let's just get right into it and start off by talking about Wes Craven's New Nightmare from 1994, a movie that came out about 3 years after Freddy's Dead. And Freddy's Dead, what a wild ride. Easily one of my least favorite movies in the franchise. A movie that a lot of people do enjoy. I get it, you know, it's silly, it's schlocky, if you're in the mood for that kind of thing. But a movie where Freddy Krueger is just completely not scary at all whatsoever. There is some fun to be had. But like I said, easily one of my least favorite movies in the franchise. But New Nightmare, for me, I kind of look at it a little bit like Nightmare on Elm Street 4. It's a movie that the more I watch it, the more I appreciate the movie, the more I enjoy the movie, the more I kind of understand what they're going for with this movie, and ages pretty well for me. But this movie definitely has its flaws, and despite this movie being pretty well received overall by fans in the franchise, I don't usually see a lot of people consider this like their least favorite movie in the franchise or anything like that. Is actually the least financially successful movie in the entire franchise. This movie was made for about $8 million and ended up making only about $20 million. So yeah, that wasn't all that great, but right off the bat, the intro kind of hooks me in with this movie without question. I mean, we get to see Wes Craven back in the movie, which is great. Miss you, Wes, but just this whole idea of a team, a special effects team, working on this stuff in a horror movie and then having it go wrong, having a life of its own and killing the people that created it. But overall, this is an intro that I do really enjoy. And like I said, it hooks me in right away. And yeah, of course, it's great to have Heather back in this movie, but also having Heather back in this movie reminds me how different Nancy's character is, in my opinion, just as a final girl, especially in comparison to a lot of the other final girls in the genre, because yeah, she's in 3 movies in this franchise, but the movies feel so disconnected with each other, but also connected at the same time. It's kind of weird because Nancy never really got that moment, kind of like a character like a Sidney Prescott in Scream 2, where a character like Sidney Prescott really did get to continue everything that happened in the original Scream. In the second Scream movie, we get to see her character pretty shortly after the events in the first movie. She's more resilient. She's 2 steps ahead of Ghostface in a little bit of a way. Whereas as great as Elm Street 2 is, and I love that movie, we never really got that with Nancy's character, where, like I said, we get to follow her shortly after the events of the first movie, which is something we never really got in this franchise. I don't know, that's just something that kind of randomly pops into my mind when I see Heather in this movie. But regardless, it is, of course, great to see Heather back in this movie. And honestly, I get why people like this movie. I mean, we get a lot of the people back from the original movie who were kind of the heart and soul of that original movie. So this movie's got that going for it. It's also a little bit of like Wes Craven's Scream before Scream. Like there's a lot of meta stuff in this. We're seeing a lot of things behind the scenes in a movie production, kind of how a movie gets made, which is cool. And of course, we're following Heather, but it's Heather's character outside of the Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but yet we're still inside of a movie. And then you're also seeing some of the things from the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise kind of come to life, jump out of the script, but in real life. I will say I like that sequence when the tension's building in the movie and then Freddy's glove comes out of the sheets in Heather's bed and then she wakes up, she goes down into the kitchen, her son's there, he's got knives taped to his fingers, he starts attacking her, then she wakes up again. I don't know, that whole scene just with the tension, the stress, the exhaustion you can clearly see on Nancy's or Heather's character in the movie after her husband died, just everything going on with that. And then on top of that, Freddy showing up, it's just like kind of one of those moments. It's like bam, bam, bam. So many things happening and being thrown at you with a lot of tension, and I think it's pretty effective for me. Also, as a dad myself to a 5 and a 7-year-old, seeing all this stuff go down with Dylan's character, I mean, it's kind of heartbreaking. It's brutal to watch. I mean, as the hospital and the people working there are kind of like misdiagnosing this poor kid as having like early stages of schizophrenia. And obviously, like, that's kind of frustrating from a viewer's perspective, especially I think if you're a parent to little kids like I am. It's kind of brutal to watch. I mean, that poor damn kid. And then also that whole moment with a lot of tension when he's like doing his little Frogger impression walking across the highway. That's a tense moment. And then also reminds me how the music in this movie, especially in the horror genre, is actually kind of unique in that moment. I feel like some of the music feels a little bit like some of those classic 90s thrillers. If you really listen to it, I feel like it reminds me of some of the music I would see in a movie like The Fugitive. I don't know. It feels unique for the genre to me. Now, speaking of Scream, for some reason, I see so many similarities between Sidney and Heather in this movie. Even though Neve Campbell was about 7 years younger than Heather is in this movie, I don't know, there's just something about them kind of dealing with the trauma and the pressure from the media in their town together. That similarity, and of course, like Sid after her mom was murdered, and Heather is also dealing with this stalker, her husband died, just all this like pressure and tension and stress going on. I don't know, there's just something about it. Of course, you got the similarity of Wes Craven made both of those movies, but I don't know, there's just something about both Sidney and Heather when I watch this movie that I see a lot of each of them in each character. And one thing I like about this movie, and I do think they do an effective job of, is the huge buildup to, man, is Heather gonna finally face Freddy again after all these years? And I think it's something like an hour and 8 minutes into the movie, they do finally face off again. Freddy gives us that "miss me" line when he pops out of the closet, but I think that's a fun moment. I think the buildup is effective. It's not one of those things where you're like, man, Freddy hasn't shown up in a while, this is getting a little boring. No, I think the build up to it, I think works really well in this movie. Speaking of Freddy, the look of Freddy in New Nightmare is a different look for the franchise without question. The mask of Freddy in this movie kind of also reminds me of the bad guy's mask in the Jim Carrey movie, The Mask. I don't know, for some reason I always think about that movie when I see this movie, but yeah, I mean, I don't think this will ever be personally considered one of my favorite looks to Freddy in the franchise because it's just not. I mean, if I'm being honest and I kind of just need to nitpick it a little bit, Freddy's face in particular kind of just looks like a guy who maybe went through a cheese grater or something. Not a bad look, but to me, it definitely looks like a guy in a mask and not a real, believable, like juicy, nasty burn victim. And I get what they were going for with the look of Freddy, something new, and I think from my understanding, they wanted Freddy's look to be a little bit older, like his wounds have healed, which I think is a great idea. That could be really scary. I just think the way that they pulled it off was just kind of okay to me. Yeah, it's just not my favorite look for Freddy in the franchise. One thing I do love in this movie, though, is towards kind of the second half of the movie when John is there. John is calling Heather Nancy now at this point. Things are kind of starting to morph together, real life with the movie life. It's starting to kind of blend together, and then John takes off in the cop car, and Nancy pans around, and the camera pans around too, to the classic Elm Street house. The Elm Street music kicks in. I don't know. I love that moment. I think it's one of the best moments in the movie and just kind of like gets me buckled up for the rest of that entire scene. Not only is that moment a bit of a mind trip in some ways, but it's also another one of those moments that hints at like this underlying theme that Wes Craven's going for, whether or not like violence and just things that happen in horror movies do actually affect real life, and then showing in this movie how things are starting to blend. And it's just kind of a little bit of a wink to critics and fans of the franchise, fans of just horror movies in general. I do like the set design at the end of this movie. I think it's pretty fun, but I prefer it when it's on Nancy's turf, and that's something that kind of helps Nancy to get the upper hand. Whereas this whole thing where we're on Freddy's turf or in his kind of realm, but yet Nancy is still able to use a lot of things in Freddy's area against him, I don't know, that feels kind of weird to me. It feels like Freddy should have a higher, just a more of an upper hand in that situation. I mean, all in all, New Nightmare just oozes the 90s, but I would consider New Nightmare kind of on the better side of 90s horror, which the 90s was definitely a weird time for the genre, a lot of ups and downs, some of the lowest of lows for a lot of the franchises in particular, but this movie I think is kind of on that better side of 90s horror. I think overall New Nightmare is well done. Definitely has fun moments. It's great to see some of the old faces back in the franchise, but To me, it's definitely not a top 3 movie in the franchise for me. It's solid, but I just don't think that it's like incredible or anything like that. All right, now of course it's time to talk about Freddy versus Jason from 2003, a movie that had definitely been in the works for many years before it came out. It almost came out in the late 80s, then it almost came out in the early 90s, then the mid 90s, and it just kept falling through for a variety of reasons. And then of course we finally got this crossover between the two arguably biggest, just greatest, most iconic horror villains in all of just horror, the horror genre in general. Now, right off the bat in this movie, I like this whole montage we're getting with Freddy narrating the entire thing, just kind of letting us know what we're in store for this movie. You know, Freddy basically needs these kids to remember him, to fear him again. And how's he going to do that? Well, he's going to bring back Jason to make that happen. Now, the Friday the 13th franchise has some crazy ways that they bring back Jason in that franchise. Some a little less believable than others, and some ways that are just completely ridiculous. But in this movie, Freddy vs. Jason, this is easily one of my favorite just sequences on how they bring Jason back. Not only do we get to see Mrs. Voorhees again, one of my favorite villains in all of horror, and yeah, it's a new actress, but I do think this new actress does a really damn good job playing Mrs. Voorhees. But it's Freddy bringing back Jason so he can head to Elm Street to take care of some business that Freddy wants him to take care of. But yeah, it's Jason's rotting corpse just kind of growing back together. You see the heart beating, then Jason emerges from the dirt, from the moss in the forest, and then just starts lumbering forward, you know, towards what Freddy wants him to do. I just think it's a really fun way to bring back Jason. And after that whole sequence, the intro kind of continues at this house, which is a whole scene that I think is a blast. It's dark, it's rainy. There's so much early 2000s nostalgia in this entire scene for me. Now, I do have a ranking of my top 13 kills in the Friday the 13th franchise, and I'm not going to spoil anything for that. You can go ahead and check out that video on my channel, but this intro does have one of my favorite kills in the entire franchise. It's a guy who's just a straight up asshole. One of those perfect characters you want to see get killed in a brutal, hilarious, crazy way, not in a way that's off screen, not in a way where, oh, the characters just find the aftermath of what happened to him. No. This dude gets absolutely massacred, and I am here for it. He's drinking the beer, he's treating the girl like shit, and then Jason shows up and he's like, oh, damn, and then just starts stabbing him brutally through the bed. His insides are coming through the bed, and then the best part of the entire kill, folds this guy in half, and pretty damn good job holding on to the beer. But yeah, a very fun kill. But just this entire opening, the setting, the vibe of it all, obviously, it lets us know what we're going to expect throughout the rest of the movie, which is dark brutality, but just a really fun intro. Also, I want to talk about Monica Keena as Laurie Campbell in this movie, who, I'll be honest, is one of my favorite final girls in either of these franchises. Is she the best final girl in either franchise? No, but I think she's really great in this movie. She has a lot of charisma. She's very likable. It is sad to see what has happened to her over the years after making this movie, but I do think she deserves her flowers because I think she's great in this movie. I wish that we could have seen her in more movies in either of these franchises. That would have been great in my opinion. And what's funny about this movie, just this cast in general, when I think about it, I actually think that the cast in this movie really reminds me of the casts that we see, especially in the first 3 Final Destination movies. And I know it's kind of a similar era, of course, but I feel like you could take either of these casts and switch them with any of the first 3 Final Destination movies, and it would work. I mean, switching Mary Elizabeth Winstead with Monica Keena or vice versa, I think it would really work in both of those movies. I don't know, that's just kind of a random thought, but I very much feel like this cast is almost identical to the first 3 casts in Final Destination. Now, one of my favorite scenes in Freddy vs. Jason involves both Jason and Freddy a little bit as well, but it's the corn rave scene. I just think everything that goes down in that scene, for the most part, is pretty damn hilarious. We get some great kills. Jason slaughtering people left and right. Freddy doing a little bit of action as well, but you get that scene with the 2 jocks, the one fat one and the bigger one. That's a hilarious scene, and for some reason, that kill, when he twists that guy's head around, has never not made me just laugh my ass off. That guy's like, this is a rave, not a Halloween party. Why don't you go find a pig to fuck? And then the bigger guy's like, invite only, corn poke, and you weren't invite. And then as soon as he says that, his head just gets completely twisted around. It's a great scene. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Varsity Blues, but overall, that whole corn rave moment with all the kills and everything that goes down, it's pretty damn hilarious. Also, one thing I will say is this movie definitely reminds me what makes Freddy great, especially in comparison to a character like Jason. Now, I love Jason, love the Friday the 13th franchise, of course, but this movie definitely reminds you how different Freddy is, especially in comparison to a character like Jason. Like, Freddy's kind of the puppet master, the brains of this operation, of course. And yeah, in some of the Friday the 13th movies, Jason is very different than he is in this movie. In this movie, he's kind of just a lumbering, like, killing machine. In some of the movies in the Friday the 13th franchise, Jason's like a little bit more of like a crafty, expert woodsman, and I do like both angles that they take with the character. I enjoy it, but Freddy is definitely kind of that witty character. He's smart in certain moments, shows a lot of charisma. Of course, he's not just like a stuntman in a mask. But yeah, when I watch this movie, it just reminds you how different Freddy is than a lot of the other horror villains in the genre who kind of just lumber around killing people left and right. I also like the look of Freddy in this movie. I think the makeup design is solid, not the best in the franchise, but I think Freddy in this movie, of course, it's kind of a dark and scary movie in some ways. But that's also how Freddy looks, which is a look that I really like for the character. Arguably, my favorite look for Freddy Krueger in the franchise might be part 2, because I think Freddy is just so scary, especially the look of him in that movie. And in this movie, Freddy also just looks dark and scary, which is a look for the character I like. But with that said, I do think they should have made Freddy a little bit wittier, a little bit more funny in this movie. I mean, we're not going like Freddy's dead here, but give us a little bit more. I mean, we do get that line like, "It's not my fault this bitch is dead on her feet." That's a funny line from Freddy. But still, I think they should have injected just a little bit more of that kind of stuff in this movie, a little bit more of just lighthearted moments to kind of offset the lumbering Jason throughout this movie. And yeah, some of the CGI stuff with the dream sequences in this movie definitely looks pretty janky, especially that scene with that worm bug thing with the hookah. I mean, come on, guys. That is some corny shit. But this movie does remind me that with modern technology, hopefully if someday we get another Elm Street movie, what we can do with some of these dream sequences with modern technology, and how we can take some of these dream sequences to a whole nother level if the movie is put into the right hands and that technology is used in the right way. There's just a lot of potential with that. And yeah, the end of this movie, I mean, it is pretty damn epic just to think about. We're getting Freddy versus Jason at one of my favorite horror locations in all of horror history, which is Camp Crystal Lake, just battling it out. And yeah, at times it does kind of feel like a Marvel superhero fight between the two of them. But overall, it is fun. They're both getting some kill shots kind of on each other, battling back and forth with a ton of blood. Laurie gives us the "welcome to my world, bitch" line, which is fun, then gives us a little homage to Pamela Voorhees' death in the original Friday the 13th by decapitating Freddy. It's a fun scene overall, and really describing that final fight kind of fits the description of this movie just as a whole. At times, it's kind of unintentionally silly, has a ton of nostalgia for me in particular. This movie's dark, it's really, really bloody, and specifically because this is an Elm Street review, just talking Freddy, I think Freddy is fun as hell in this movie, and also looks pretty good. All right, is it now time to talk about the remake? All right, let's talk about the remake, A Nightmare on Elm Street from 2010. Which has gotta be the most hated movie in this entire franchise. And I'm not talking about hate like Freddy's Dead gets, where people are like, "Oh, that movie is silly, that movie is dumb." No, people are so passionate about their hate for the remake. I mean, if you even mention this movie in their presence, they get super pissed. With that said though, still to this day, the remake is the most financially successful, the highest grossing movie in the entire franchise at about $117 million. Now, originally, this is a Platinum Dunes movie, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a second, but kind of like the Friday the 13th movie, the route that they went with that movie in 2009, they were considering doing something similar, how the Friday the 13th movie kind of encapsulates like everything that's great about the first 4 movies, and they pack that into one movie. They were considering doing the same thing with Elm Street, which Damn, man, that would have been pretty epic. But there's still some good things to talk about this movie in particular, in my opinion. Now, of course, that whole concept around the Friday the 13th movie from 2009, Friday the 13th just in general is kind of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's kind of the core of that franchise in a way. Whereas the people who created this movie in particular, the Platinum Dunes team, produced by Michael Bay, everybody else involved in the production, they saw Nightmare on Elm Street just at its core as like a much darker, much more sinister type of a movie. And with this movie, they definitely wanted to lean into that and make Freddy scary again, which of course was not the case with Freddy's Dead. And even New Nightmare, I don't think Freddy was all that scary, but in this movie, I mean, yeah, they definitely lean into that with Freddy. Now let's talk about the opening of this movie, which is a setting that I actually really love. I think that diners that are usually open late or open 24 hours a day are kind of perfect for a franchise built around not sleeping. But personally, I just love diners. I try to go as many diners as I possibly can. And this diner in particular, this entire scene, it's dark, it's raining, and you mix that with like the neon lights going on. I don't know, I just love the vibe. And then when that guy from Twilight stabs himself and then brutally slits his own throat, it's letting us know right away this movie is definitely going to try to make you squirm. And yeah, I mentioned Platinum Dunes just a second ago, but this is another one of those movies in the long list of Platinum Dunes horror movies that they made kind of around this era in particular. And maybe I'm in the minority on this, maybe I'm not, but personally, I like what Platinum Dunes has done for the horror genre. I like a lot of the movies they've made. The 2009 Friday the 13th movie, really like that movie. The Texas Chainsaw remake that they made, really like that movie a lot. And then this movie too has a lot of fun stuff about it. And of course, a big question going into when this movie came out is who is going to play Nancy? How are they going to go about just navigating the Nancy character? And we get Rooney Mara as Nancy Holbrook in this movie. And this character of Nancy, you know, she's not the best final girl in horror. She's not even close to Heather Langenkamp's version of the character, of course. She's kind of like this loner. She's a little bit more artsy. She even talks about it, how she doesn't fit in with like the regular crowd, which, you know, I guess does share some similarities a little bit with Heather's character here and there, but they are very different characters in a lot of ways, but I still do think that Rooney does a good job. I like her character. I like the way she portrays her character. I think they went for something with her character, and I think they pulled it off. Was it necessarily the best creative choice on how they went about choosing how her character was going to be in this movie? No, not really, but I do think it fits this style of the movie. I also like Kyle Gallner in this movie. I think he's great in this. I think people are finally coming around to the fact that he's a pretty solid actor, especially after what he did in Strange Darling, a movie that if you haven't seen it yet, highly recommend seeing Strange Darling. Very good movie. But yeah, I think Kyle Gallner, just in general, is a very good actor, and he's great in this movie. And yeah, I have to talk about what they did with Freddy Krueger in the remake. And I'll be honest, I actually overall like what they did and the route that they took with Freddy in this movie. He does actually look like a real burn victim, how his nose is kind of smaller. It's hard for him to kind of use expressions because of all of the scar tissue. That is realistic, and I like that. Yeah, there's some moments where the CGI on his face is not great. The CGI on Freddy's face in this movie was done by the same effects team that did the CGI on Two-Face in The Dark Knight, but I think overall, just adding that element of making it a little bit nastier with some holes in it that you can kind of see through with Freddy's face is a cool idea. Now, with Freddy's voice, though, I do think it's overall okay. I think some moments it sounds a little too digital, in my opinion, and I get the realism they're going for with, like, the lack of Freddy's ability to kind of express himself and enunciate because of the scar tissue from the burns, but I do think the character kind of mumbles a little bit too much, in my opinion, in certain moments, like, "Nancy, you've always been one of my favorites." It just sounds kind of a little weird in some of the scenes. I wish they would have gone for more of like an entertaining approach as opposed to like more of a realistic approach with the voice in particular. But overall, with the Freddy Krueger character in the remake, I mean, go ahead and kill me for saying this, but I do think it's a pretty scary version of the character. By the way, Jackie Earle Haley, not a bad little Tom Cruise running moment there when the parents are chasing him. But yeah, Jackie Earle Haley nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor a few years before this movie. But a big gripe that I do have with the Freddy character in this movie is I don't love how they make Freddy's character a whiny little bitch before they Molotov cocktail his ass. That whole scene where the parents chase him and he locks himself in there and he's whining, he's saying how he's innocent. He just kind of sounds like a whiny little bitch, which makes it less scary and less believable that Freddy in the dream sequences after that moment in the movie would then be this big, scary, like unstoppable, terrifying force. I don't know, after that scene, it takes away from the character, in my opinion, and makes him way less scary. I feel like the more effective route to keep Freddy mysterious and still scary as a character would have just been if the parents found him hiding out, Freddy never saw them, and then they just burned him alive. Now, of course, Wes Craven's original backstory for the character of Freddy Krueger in the original movie, he had to change and just make Freddy a child killer because of some of the stuff mainly that was going on in the media at the time, which he thought would kind of butcher the movie's chances for success. Whereas in this movie, they decide to go back to those original, really, really dark roots of the character of Freddy Krueger, which for me as a dad, it is pretty brutal, man. Like, it gets really, really dark at times and definitely makes you feel something. So I guess, there is something to be said about that. And just this whole idea of we have this picture of these preschool kids and Freddy's just kind of taking them out one by one by one. Man, yeah, it's just pretty damn sinister. I actually don't mind the angle that they take in this movie with the micro sleeping stuff. I actually think it's pretty effective for me because, we're 9 movies into the franchise up until this point. So just going about the normal route of, a character has to be sitting down in order to see Freddy, a character has to lay down in order to have a crazy dream sequence. It's kind of new and kind of fresh that these things can kind of pop up at any time, especially later on in the movie when the characters are more sleep deprived. I get what they're going for here, and I think it works for me. Like that moment when Quentin is swimming and then the whole dream sequence happens just like unexpectedly. I think it's fun, and I think it does add to the movie. Now, to talk about the ending a little bit, I think the fight between the 3 of them is pretty fun. It's nothing mind-blowing, nothing super unique. Nancy cuts off Freddy's glove and then slits his throat, and then they burn down the school with Freddy still in there. I think it's pretty solid, nothing great, nothing mind-blowing like I said, but I think it does get the job done. And then that moment at the end of the movie where you kind of think everything is over, similar to the original Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but without the blow-up doll, the mom gets the fingers through the eye holes and Freddy pulls her into the mirror. Kind of just a fun little moment. Yeah, does it need to be in the movie? No, but I think it is a fun little way to end the movie. In the end though, I get why people don't like this movie. I kind of look at it similar to the Rob Zombie Halloween movies, where that movie, the core tone of that movie is just so different than the original movies that people fell in love with, which is very similar to this movie. But maybe it's because of my age, I just enjoy this era of horror, and I think this movie does do a lot of things in it that I think are pretty fun. Now, to me, just because a movie is very dark and very sinister doesn't necessarily make it a bad movie for me, because this movie definitely makes me feel something, which, like I said earlier, there's something to be said about that. This movie definitely isn't my least favorite movie in the franchise, nor is it my favorite movie in the franchise by any means. But there are some things in this movie that I do really like. But with that said, and more importantly, guys, it has been 15 years since we've had a new Nightmare on Elm Street movie. That is a travesty that we need to change ASAP. But there you go, everybody. That is my thoughts on the rise and fall of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies 7, 8, and 9. Let me know down in the comments down below what you think about these movies. If you want some more videos from me right now, I'll go ahead and link some Nightmare on Elm Street videos for you right here that I think you'll enjoy. If you don't want to miss future videos on the channel, make sure you subscribe. That is the best way to go about doing that. Also, I have a Patreon as well if you want to go ahead and check that out for some more bonus exclusive content only for Patreon. Also, all of my social media links will be down below in the description as well if you want to go and follow me over there. But again, thanks so much for watching, everybody. My name is Matt, and I will talk to you in the next one.